Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we're reading The American Slave Coast by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're on chapter 27, which starts on page 364. It's titled, I Do Not Threaten the Government with Civil War. And it starts with a quote, an excerpt from a letter to President Thomas Jefferson dated July 10th, 1806, from the then governor of Louisiana, W.C.C. Claiborne, who said, the facility with which the sugar planters amass wealth is almost incredible. It is not uncommon with 20 working hands to make from $10,000 to $14,000, and there are several planters whose fields Negroes do not exceed 40 who make more than $20,000 each year. Greetings, forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Georgia, the only state to have legally imported slaves from Africa since the Constitution took effect, finally banned both the African and interstate slave trade in 1798, at a time when maritime commerce was disturbed by war. During the years the trade was open, Charleston merchants and factors had sold large cargoes of slaves in Savannah, and a class of Georgia traders had grown up as well. Slave trading continued after the ban, but illicitly, not subject to legal regulation or protection. In 1802, the South Carolina legislature renewed the prohibition against both foreign and interstate slave trades. As had previously been the case in both Chesapeake and Carolina, it was a regional issue. About half of the population at the time of Charleston at the time was enslaved. Upcountry, the enslaved population comprised only about one-fifth of the total. Not only did the Low Country's large slaveholders, who were firmly in control, want to disempower their upcountry competition by denying them labor, they wanted to control the labor market so that upcountry would have to buy its labor from the low country without having access to competitors from Virginia and Maryland. So they were all about competing, anti-competition. They didn't want any competition, and they don't want any competition to this very day. That's why they try to shut African American people out of educational opportunities and apprenticeships. Charleston's newspapers published excited reports of the productivity of the new Louisiana Territory, with clear implications being that Louisiana had insufficient slave labor. South Carolina could easily supply it, since Charleston had, since 1790, carried slaves to New Orleans via its commercial, albeit treacherous and irregular, coastwise shipping route around the Spanish-held Floridas to New Orleans. For South Carolina legislators, long attuned to fast-changing market conditions, it was time to act. To the surprise of many political observers, writes Lacey K. Ford, in late November 1803, just 1 year after the desultory rejection of inland cotton growers' pleas for reopened slave trade routes, the South Carolina legislature suddenly began a serious reconsideration of the issue. Undoubtedly, this was prompted both by persistent backcountry pressure and the prospect of supplying regions and legions of slaves to the lower Louisiana Territory for handsome profits. The two intersect interests cut a deal. The merchants of Charleston got the African slave trade, whose victims they could sell to Louisiana and Mississippi, and the upcountry planters got the interstate slave trade, which would allow them to buy enslaved labor from Chesapeake. So, this is telling you a little bit about our history as African Americans and how, if you're from Mississippi or Louisiana, you're more likely to be able to find some remnant of your African heritage and enslaved, lineage. But if you're from the East Coast, the Chesapeake, you would have to look in different areas to find your lineage, because in the Chesapeake, they were heavily into breeding farms. They wanted to cut off your African identity. But in the South, in the deep South, they wanted African slaves because they were cheaper than homegrown slaves. The news had not been 5 hours in the city, wrote Charleston bookseller E.S. Thomas, before two large British Guineamen that had been lying on and off port for several days expecting it came up to town. And from the day my business began to decline, for those next 4 years, available resources went to investing in slaves. It was not yet clear what the laws of an American controlled Louisiana would be, but in adjacent Mississippi, under Claiborne's governorship, Congress had since 1798 allowed the interstate but not the foreign trade, requiring planters to buy from American slave vendors. With the cotton boom underway, Natchez was already a developed slave market, and Louisiana could, and as it happened did, radically widen that opportunity. It was clear that though the interstate trade to Louisiana was at that moment prohibited, the territory was being set up as a market for Virginia slaves, and South Carolina wanted in on the action. Beyond the simple lure of making sales, there was an additional compelling reason for South Carolina to sell slaves to Louisiana. Louisiana had a hard money supply, courtesy of the Spanish. Spain did its business the old-fashioned way, paying bills with silver mined out of the ground in Mexico. Claiborne reported from New Orleans to Secretary of State James Madison in June 16, 1805, that two Spanish schooners from Veracruz had arrived at this port and are consigned to the Marquis Casacalvo. They brought with them a large sum of silver. Reports say $100,000, but it is believed that the real amount is much greater. This money is said to be destined for the payment of pensions allowed to persons residing in Louisiana, and to meet the expenses of the Marquis has or may incur as Commissioner of Limits. South Carolina had no such shipments coming in. Louisiana offered a chance for Carolina merchants to get silver instead of paper that might depreciate or become worthless. The Creoles had silver Spanish dollars, and they were eager to buy slaves. The previous peak in South Carolina importation of Africans was 1773, when an estimated 8,000 plus slaves were brought in. This time, when South Carolina reopened the African trade, they brought in far and away the largest single concentration of victims that came to North America in any comparable period. The following table is the estimated embarkations using the Eltis and Richardson numbers. In 1804, they brought in 7,643. In 1805, they brought in 8,592. In 1806, they almost doubled it and brought in 15,551. In 1807, they added almost 10,000 more by bringing in 23,174. And in 1808, they brought in only 498 slaves from Africa, for a total during these 5 years of 55,458. Eltis and Richardson show an estimated 12% death rate, with 47,281 arriving alive. Some estimates of the traffic are higher. James McMillan believes that more than 70,000 Africans, which is a phenomenal number, arrived into the Low Country during the 4 years from 1804 to 1807. This is their hyperbolic discussion where they believe that 70,000 Africans during 4 years is a phenomenal number. It's not a phenomenal number. These people were money hungry. Some of these newly arrived Africans were sent on to Jamaica, Barbados, or other Antillean territories, and it's unclear how many of them were re-exported to Louisiana. At least 5,000, believes Lacey K. Ford, which is more than 10% of the Eltis Richardson estimate of Africans trafficked to South Carolina, but the number could be larger. There were definitely a commercial corridor in slaves. Gwendolyn Mildo Hall, Afro-Louisiana's database, shows that between 1806 and 1810, 76% of the captives that she was able to obtain documentation for who came into the port of New Orleans arrived from South Carolina, versus only 3% for other U.S. ports of origins. A sample that does not include the migration of some 10,000 people, about a third of them enslaved to New Orleans from eastern Cuba in 1809 to 1810. So what he's saying is that these forced migrations that they didn't count those people. So they really don't know how many enslaved people they trafficked. Her statistics for 1811 and 1812 show 67% from South Carolina. A committee report to Congress on February 17, 1806, stated flatly, African slaves lately imported into Charleston have been thence conveyed into the territory of New Orleans, and in their opinion, this practice will be continued to a very great extent while there is no law to prevent it. So they were going to pack the territory of New Orleans with as many African enslaved people as possible, because that was the wild, wild west. That was the newest territory that they could take over. That was the newest place where they could ship the slaves and still make profit and still have that profit come back to them in the North. So they worked together. Never forget that. Some of the Africans were taken out past New Orleans to Natchez, though in the pre-steam days, it was hard work getting a boat up the Mississippi River. The Lucy left Charleston on July 4th, 1806, carrying 50 Negroes insured from Charleston to Natchez, the premium 7.5%. During the Missouri Compromise debate in 1820, South Carolina Senator William Smith, arguing in favor of unlimited slavery, entered into the congressional record the following passage about the importations of 1803 through 1807, which shows how little the Carolinians were involved in the actual business of importation as opposed to selling the captives, saying, The whole number imported by the merchants and planters of Charleston and its vicinity were only 2,006. Nor were the slaves imported by foreigners and other American vessels and owners sold to the Carolinas, only in small part. They were sold to the people of the western states, Georgia, New Orleans, and a considerable quantity were sent to the West Indies, especially when the market became dull in Carolina. So, a number of the slaves brought into Louisiana through 1810 came from Africa through South Carolina via the coastwise trade. The manifests before 1818 were lost, but the one stray surviving manifest from 1807 is for a new Negro man, in other words, African born, coming to New Orleans from Charleston. Probably, Charleston was the source from which George W. Morgan received the cargo of 30 people, 20 adults, and 10 children, from two widely separated regions of Africa that he advertised in the New Orleans Gazette and Commercial Advertiser, dated August 13th, 1806. Though they could also have been plucked by the pirates off of a ship headed for Cuba. His ad says, African slaves just received for sale by the subscriber, 20 prime young men, 4 boys, and 6 girls of the Mandingo and Congo nations. The whole together will be sold on moderate terms. But there was also competition from the Chesapeake, as per the February 5th, 1807 advertisement from the same paper says, for sale, 103 valuable Maryland Negroes, accustomed to plantation work. These Negroes will be sold by families, the whole of them forming only 2 gangs taken from only 2 plantations, for terms apply to P.F. de Burgh and C.B. Dufoy. Another advertisement in the exact same paper shows the participation of the Charlestonians in the same business, offering 140 Negroes brutes, the nation Congo, to Francophone buyers. I do not threaten the government with civil war, says 140 prime Congo Negroes now on board the brig Ethiopian Captain Walsh from Charleston, being the first choice from a cargo of 400, for sale at auction by Patton and Mossy. Friday 13th, instant terms of payment. Approved endorsed notes at 6 and 12 months. So as you can see, at every opportunity, they were advertising in this particular paper their slaves that they had for sale. The re-exporting Africans was not a business that benefited most South Carolinians, nor did most of the money stay in Charleston. The Carolinians were middlemen, not suppliers. They had a harbor, but not a transatlantic shipping industry of their own, so the profits from carrying went elsewhere. As a planter from Petey wrote, during the non-importation movement of 1769 and 1770, purchasing Negroes is in fact purchasing British manufacturers. Charleston customs entries for 1806 show 33 slave ships from Africa as being owned by British proprietors, followed by 13 from Rhode Island, then 3 from New Jersey, 3 from Charleston, and 2 from Ireland. So when the Irish tell you that they are our friends, their ancestors trafficked in us as well. breaking down a customs count of 39,075 slaves declared as entering into Charleston between 1804 and 1807, Elizabeth Donnan found 19,949 of them entering on British ships, 7,958 on Rhode Island vessels, and only 2,006 imported by merchants and planters of Charleston and vicinity. Presumably, the same 2006 cited by Smith. The forecast says, "We have no friends. Most overseas and slave patrols were Irish." Exactly. The Carolinians tried to make their money on volume in an unprecedented mass retailing experiment. Their greed was matched by that of the shippers, the largest numbers of whom were in Liverpool. They knew the market could be closing soon. The Liverpool slavers' heaviest shipping period was the last 10 years of the trade. During that time, they also sold slaves to the British Army, who purchased them for conscription into the West India Regiment, an arrangement that only ended with the end of the African slave trade. From January 1st, 1806, through the prohibition of the trade on May 1st, 1807, the height of the South Carolina importation, 185 ships from Liverpool carried in 49,213 Africans. You know, the Irish have this rumor that they were also slaves, and the forecast reminds me of that. He says, "How can the Irish be slaves if they know they Irish? You can't tell where you're from. Nobody should ever call them, the Irish, slaves." Exactly. In this free for all slave importation scene, people from a widely different parts of Africa turned up in Charleston, from Congo, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, and other regions. Omar ibn Sayed, an Islamic scholar from Senegal, Afula, who arrived in Charleston in 1807, described his experience in a 15-page 1831 autobiography, one of 14 manuscripts he wrote in Arabic while enslaved, where he said, "There came to our place a large army, who killed many men, and took me and brought me to the great sea, and sold me into the hands of the Christians, who bound me on board a great ship, and we sailed upon the great sea a month and a half. When we came to a place called Charleston in the Christian language, there they sold me to a small, weak, and wicked man called Johnson, a complete infidel who had no fear of God at all. Now I am a small man and unable to do hard work. So I fled from the hand of Johnson, and after a month came to a place called Fayetteville. The unilateral reopening of the slave trade by South Carolina caused much anger in the rest of the country, both in the Upper South and in the abolitionist strongholds. Newspapers in South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina, Tennessee, Maryland, and Virginia all strongly criticized South Carolina's decision. But the Carolina press became especially defensive when the criticism came from the North, as in this piece from the Charleston Courier, dated July 10th, 1806, which takes on a mocking tone not unfamiliar in other areas of the American politics. They said, "As to the epithet of thieves which an unnamed Philadelphia editor probably Ben Franklin, applies to those who bring slaves from Africa, we shall presently see whether we cannot apply it to the pure and immaculate and the demure Philadelphian and some other of the northern cities where they bellowing out, humanity, 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 oh, the rights of the dear insulted human nature. As captives died awaiting sale, Charlestonians were irritated by the captain's practice of disposing of the corpses on the cheap by just throwing them overboard, in consequence of which, reported traveler John Lambert, nobody would eat any fish. A city ordinance of 1805, printed in the Charleston Courier, noted that since the importation of slaves from Africa, several incidents have occurred of dead human bodies having been thrown into the waters or of the harbor of Charleston, and provided that not only should a fine of $100 be imposed, but that the offenders' names should be published in the several gazettes of Charleston, to hold up every such offender to public detestation. Still, the numbers of advertisements for luxury goods in the 4 pages of the previous mentioned issue leave us no doubt that, bodies floating in the harbor or not, the Charlestonians were prosperous. But since all those goods had to be imported either from the North or from Europe, their money quickly left the city again on northbound boats. So no matter how much money they actually had or could raise from their enslaving businesses, they actually were just middlemen funneling that money from one person to the next, consumer goods getting consumer goods that didn't have a long shelf life, and they resented that. Looking forward to January 1, 1808, expiration of the constitutionally specified guarantee that the African slave trade could exist, President Jefferson's message to Congress on December 2nd, 1806, proactively called for its prohibition as of the first constitutionally permissible day. In defending the urgency of his proposal, as was necessary to forestall a final cycle of African expeditions, Jefferson also presented it as a moral issue. He said, I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, and which the morality, the reputation, and the best of our country have long been eager to proscribe, although no law you may pass can take the prohibitory effect until the first day of the year 1808, yet the intervening period is not too long to prevent by timely notice expeditions which cannot be completed before that day. Listening to that makes you think that Jefferson might have actually been on the side of the African, but he wasn't. He was on the side of his pockets because he saw that he would be able to continue to earn more money from the domestic slave trade than he could earn from the foreign slave trade, because African slaves were usually more military minded and they were cheaper. They were cheaper than the ones that they were able to create here in the Americas. A bill was duly proposed the following day. However moral it may have seemed for Jefferson to lament the violations of human rights, ending the transatlantic slave trade did nothing to end slavery itself. Instead, it replaced one inhumane slave trade with another. This action of Jefferson's has been praised as, in one historian's words, his greatest act of humane egalitarianism. Perhaps in his layers of intellectual complexity, Jefferson thought so himself. We will resist the temptation to psychoanalyze, but in practice, it was no such thing. It was an act to transform American slavery into a purely domestic industry, reducing the nation's dependence on foreign sources of supply for slaves and bringing the entire slave trade under Virginia's control. Nor was this an unforeseen consequence. It was the predictable, desired outcome, which is why South Carolina and Georgia opposed the bill, albeit unsuccessfully. The bill was referred to a House committee of 4 Southerners from Georgia, Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, and 3 Northerners, with Peter Early of Georgia as chair. In debate, Early answered John Simile of Pennsylvania, who wanted a capital punishment for slave importers, with the words that put Jefferson's high-flown appeal in perspective. Mr. Simile has said that in the United States, slavery is felt and acknowledged to be a great evil, and that therefore we will execute a severe law to prevent the increase of this evil. Permit me to tell the gentleman of a small distinction in this case. A large majority of people in the Southern states do not consider slavery as a crime. They do not believe it immoral to hold human flesh in bondage. Many deprecate slavery as an evil, as a political evil, but not as a crime. Reflecting men apprehend at some future day evils, incalculable evils from it, but it is a fact that few, very few, consider it a crime. It is best to be candid on this subject. If they considered the holding of men in slavery a crime, then they would necessarily accuse themselves, a thing which human nature revolts at. I will tell the truth. A large majority of the people in the Southern states do not consider slavery even as an evil. So they didn't even think of it as wrong in any way, shape, form, or fashion to hold people in bondage for their exclusive profit, because they believed, some of them believed, that they were these great patriarchs of old that had people under them that they were taking care of. Some of them were strictly profit driven. Some of them believed that they were taking care of Black people because Black people did not have enough sense to take care of themselves. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're on page 373 of the of the American Slave Coast. We're talking about the chapter 26, which is I Do Not Threaten the Government with Civil War. This was a long way from Madison, Jefferson, Henry, and even Pierce Butler and Henry Lawrence protestations that slavery was an evil forced upon North America by Britain, one to which there was unfortunately no effective end in sight, because free Blacks could supposedly not live together with whites. South Carolina was the center of an expanding commercial empire, and slavery at the heart of that vision. To hear Carolina slave owners tell it, slavery was a positive good for mankind. This sentiment, soon to be institutionalized by South Carolina's John C. Calhoun, had already become common. What to do with enslaved people rescued from slave ships was a problem as well. Should the federal government sell them at auction? When it was proposed that they be indentured for a term in a free state, Early responded by threatening civil war while claiming the contrary, according to the minutes in the Annals of Congress, where he said, the inhabitants of the southern states would resist this provision with their lives. We want no civil wars, no rebellions, no insurrections, no resistance to the authority of the government. Give effect, then, to this wish, and do not pass this bill as it now stands. Mr. Smiley says, this opens such a scene as I never expected to witness in this House. If it were not owing to the impulse of the moment and the influence of passion, I should think it extremely reprehensible. Are we to be threatened with civil war? What our laws, that our laws will be resisted at the peril of life? Sir, this is new doctrine. The gentleman must know that we are not to be terrified by a threat of civil war. Mr. Early said, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, who is Mr. Smiley, had made a palatable misrepresentation of his sentiments. I do not threaten the government with civil war. I only communicated the idea that military force would be necessary to carry the law into execution. The Senate added to the bill a prohibition against the coastwise slave trade for ships of less than 40 tons burden, which made it impossible for small vessels intercepted at sea bearing slaves from the Antilles to claim that they were engaging in domestic coastwise trade. This infuriated Southerners. Virginia's senior senator, the voluble, unhinged, but not perceptive John Randolph, who owned some 400 slaves, argued that, as summarized in the Congressional Reporter, the provision of the bill touched the right of private property. He feared at the future period it might be made the pretext of universal emancipation. He had rather lose the bill. He had rather lose all the bills of the session. He had rather lose every bill ever passed since the establishment of the government than to agree to the provision contained in this slave bill. It went to blow up the Constitution in ruins. Mr. Randolph said, if ever the time of disunion between the states should arrive, the line of severance would be between the slaveholding and the non-slaveholding states. Over Randolph's objections, the 40 tons clause remained, setting in place a mechanism that favored large operators in the coastwise slave trade. The Senate version also included a requirement that the ship's captain submit a manifest naming each enslaved passenger to the customs collector or the surveyor, or both, at the port of departure and at the port of arrival, with the customs officer performing a roll call at either end. New Orleans was the principal port of arrival, but far from the only one. The trade stretched to Galveston. The result of this requirement is that both inward and outward manifests exist. Many have been lost, but even so, these filled in, commercially pre-printed forms constitute the best record of the trade. Jefferson signed the act prohibiting the African trade on March 2nd, 1807, to take effect the first day of 1808. Britain, meanwhile, having lost tens of thousands of men in its attempts to take Saint-Domingue, and under strong domestic pressure from the abolitionists who had organized themselves into an effective political movement, put an end to its lucrative involvement in the slave trade by a measure that received royal assent on March 25, 1807. The British law did not have to wait until the first day of the year to be effective, so it took effect before the already passed American prohibition did. Though a British abolition law would have to wait until 1833, ending the transatlantic slave trade was a major turning point. Over the decades, the British Navy enforced it at sea, not only with respect to British ships, but stopping slave ships from other nations as well. So they were the police of the sea. As the shutoff approached, South Carolina traders turned the spigot on wide as it would open. By the final year, the market was gutted, with fatal consequences for the Africans who piled up in holding pens. John Lambert reported that in 1807, the sales for slaves was extremely dull owing to the high price which the merchants demanded for them. The planters, who were pretty well stocked, were not very eager to purchase, and the merchants, knowing that a market would ultimately be found for them, were determined to not lower their demands, in consequence of which hundreds of these poor beings were obliged to be kept on board ships or in large buildings at Gadsden's Wharf for months together. Exhausted and sick, many of the captives died because they would rather us die than to let us be free. They would rather us to die rather than to lower the price and lower their profit margin. They would rather us to die than to sacrifice 1 ounce of profit. Macmillan believes that as many as 1,600 newly arrived Africans may have perished on the Charleston Wharf over 4 months. By November, the major traders seem to have agreed to hold captives back from the market. With Jefferson having shut off the African trade, Virginia and Maryland traders settled into their newly protected domestic slave trade. William Dusenberry's comment about another president, James K. Polk, is equally applicable in the case of Jefferson, where he said, his political conviction was congruent with what appeared to be his own financial interest. So the way that he handled his politics was the same way he handled his financial interests, and that he veered and guided his politics by his financial interests. For Jefferson, as for other large slaveholders, the end of African importation was a crucial step in protecting and growing their net worth. which perhaps explains the support Jefferson received from Virginia and the South in general during his subsequent measure. Unique in the annals of American history, a complete embargo of all overseas trade. And that's the end of chapter 26. 27? 27. That's the end of chapter 27. So, as you can see, these people would do anything for profit, right? They would do anything to maximize their ability and their capacity to make money. As they were like similar to today with economic protectionism that's happening, people say, oh, we're increasing tariffs so that people are encouraged to buy American because the American products don't have the tariffs on them. Some American products are inferior. Did you ever think about that? They felt that the slaves from the Americas were superior and could command a higher price because those slaves did not have a sense of freedom. Those slaves had only ever known breeding farms. Those slaves knew stories and had hushed whispers of what it was like to be free. They held those stories in high regard, but the reality of the situation is most of them were multi-generational slaves. Multi-generational slaves. It only takes one generation to wipe out your memory, because if you work the parents to death and you raise the child, that child is only going to know the information that you put in their minds. And if all they know is that they a slave, then how would they begin to formulate a, a pathway to become free when they have no free identity? All the limits have been placed on them from birth. So it only takes a generation to wipe out that memory, because at the point that you cut off intergenerational knowledge transmission, even if I know somebody else's story, even if I hear a fable, even if I know something else for another people, it's not personal to me. And I will think of myself as less than and lower than. And as they said, Thomas Jefferson was only interested in ending the transatlantic slave trade because he had already put in place a mechanism for him to gain wealth through the domestic slave trade by creating enslaved people from his loins, from the loins of these people. So that's all I have to say. All right, guys, I will be back Thursday. It looks like we'll be reading from Niggas to Gods. Hopefully, you'll have some questions for me. I appreciate Anthony McPhail and the forecast for being here with me tonight. I know that Sister Raw and the elders are listening. I know that KW Don 7 is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast is listening. I know that Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. Manning for Mayor is listening. Bawana Haguziki is listening. And so many others. I appreciate you. I value your input. I appreciate the fact that you take the time to spend this little bit of time with me on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where we read through and review these documents and we can talk about them. At the end of the day, just know that we don't have any global friends. We have temporary allies for a specific cause and reason. Know that no other group has experienced the enslavement of themselves and their people, and the cutting off of their history, and the intergenerational knowledge transmission that was forbidden like we were. We are a special and peculiar people set apart for a specific purpose. The question is, do you know your purpose? All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.